Empathy is often presented as a kind of improvement or upgrade on sympathy or compassion. When someone puts you on a guilt trip, how does it actually work? Well, the idea is that you care for them, you love them, and if they seem to be sad, if they're hurt, then you're more likely to go along with whatever it is they want to do to make it better. And so people learn that and they take advantage of you. At bottom line, are your feelings, even the feelings that you share from others, is it anchored to something? Is it anchored to Christ? Is he God, or are the feelings God?
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel is a place where we like to do theology videos, church history videos, and Reformation apologetics videos. And today we'll be on the theology part of that intro. With us, we have Dr. Joe Rigney. Dr. Joe Rigney serves as a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College and a pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He is the author of 8 books, including Leadership and Emotional Sabotage and The Sin of Empathy, Compassion, and Its Counterfeits, which is the book that we'll be discussing today. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being willing to come on. Like I said, we had some scheduling difficulties trying to get this together, but I'm glad that we have you with us here. So we'll be discussing your book. I know that people may just, in fact, I've been seeing most of the people online that I've seen hate on your book have been hating on it just from the title alone, which is definitely an interesting set of affairs. Whenever you read a book and you see that, like, wow, a lot of these people are just not reading it,
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
I thought it'd be good if we kick off with just some key definitions and we get to dispel maybe anyone that has already pulled out their torches and their pitchforks here, and try to explain to them what it is that you even mean by the sin of empathy. So in this book, you make a case for, quote, virtuous, compassionate Christian sympathy, which binds itself to biblical truth and courageously brings others out of darkness into light. So, to anticipate some of these angry comments below, in the opening pages of the foreword to your book, Rosaria Butterfield explicitly says that you are not against empathy simpliciter. Later in your first chapter, you talk about different senses of the word empathy and what it is that you are specifically writing against. So, what are some of the ways that empathy is commonly understood today? And well, let's just start there. What are some of the ways that this word empathy is commonly understood today?
Yeah, it's interesting. Empathy, for all of its, everybody seems to know what it means. But having been at this for 8 or 9 years now, talking about the dangers of it, it's amazing how many different true definitions of empathy people will throw at you. They'll say, "No, no, Rigney, what you're talking about is not empathy; it's this, and this is always different." So there's a lot of confusion. Researchers recognize this when they're trying to study the phenomenon. The word comes into English like in the early 20th century. It's not an ancient word. I think it does cover ancient human concepts, universal human concepts. But probably the simplest way to get into it would be to say sympathy, which empathy is often put in contrast to in the modern context. Sympathy means to suffer with. That's just literally what it means. It comes from the Greek, sympathizo. It's in the Bible, to suffer with someone. And compassion is the Latin equivalent. So compassion and sympathy are roughly synonymous. And then empathy is often presented as a kind of improvement or upgrade on sympathy or compassion. There's a famous viral video from Brene Brown in which she contrasts sympathy and empathy in precisely this way. Sympathy is the sort of thing that leads to disconnection between people. It's aloof, it's detached, it's judgmental, it's cold. Sympathy, it doesn't get the job done when people are hurting. Meanwhile, empathy is a sacred space. It's more immersion in the sufferings of people, joining them deep, deep down in the pit and staying out of judgment. So that's kind of how it's often set up. So when I'm treating this in a situation where you have these different definitions floating around, you have to kind of pick one and go with it. So in the book, I define empathy one of two ways. You use it one of two ways usually. One is simply emotion sharing. If you feel sad, I feel sad. If you feel happy, I feel happy. Emotion sharing. And in that sense, I don't have a problem with it. Some element of that is actually essential to Christian love and commanded by the Bible, right? Weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice, gets at that idea. I'm not opposed to that at all. But often it's that more total immersion thing is where empathy is actually used to cover that. And so that's where it becomes untethered. It becomes excessive. It becomes all encompassing. Passions and emotions are powerful. Other people's passions and emotions are powerful. And so when that version of empathy is in view, no boundaries, no judgment, no limitation, no questions. Just join me in everything that I'm feeling. And when I've said that, people say, no one thinks that that's good. And I say, yeah, but they still do it. And they cover it in the term empathy, right? So that's the basic idea. It's if I'm when I'm being more precise, I'll talk about the sin of untethered empathy, empathy that's untethered, unanchored, unmoored in what is true and good and right. That's the sin. Whereas compassion, as I use it generally, normally, is it's tethered, it's anchored. It seeks to move into suffering, move toward the hurting, but does so while it's anchored to something sturdy outside of their feelings.
Yeah. Well, and some people see, again, your precise definition here of being against untethered empathy as almost a sort of like concession that's being made. And they're like, aha, see, so it's not just empathy, it's untethered empathy. So, but the thing is, I feel like none of these people would say the same thing if someone is pointing out the sin of anger and someone's like, ah,
Right.
but there's a way to be righteously angry. And you're like, well, yeah,
Yes.
right. Like, who's contesting that? Like, we're saying the sin of anger, right? So this seems to imply that
Yes.
there's a sinful way that we can be angry, but it seems that a lot of people don't give that same kind of charity when it comes to something like the sin of empathy, which is bizarre.
And I think and I think I think one element is we associate anger is typically called a negative emotion, and so it's easier for people to have a bucket for um, righteous versus unrighteous anger, or governed versus ungoverned anger, and so they're used to that. Um, the the play that's been run on us is we think that certain things are so good they could never go bad, and so empathy gets put in that category, right? It's how could you possibly be against something so good? But one of the things I learned from C.S. Lewis, in fact, one of the main things I think I learned from C.S. Lewis, is it's the greatest earthly goods that can become the greatest evils when they go bad. So, for example, Lewis, in a lot of his works, warned about, say, mother love, maternal love, which who could be against that? And he said, yeah, it's a great and glorious thing when God's hand is on the reins. But when God's hand isn't on the reins, that same maternal love, that same maternal instinct to care for her children becomes devouring, possessive. He talks about the maternal vampire who sort of seeks to own and encompass her people. And so Lewis's book, The Four Loves, actually served as an inspiration for some of my own work, because in that book, he talks about the danger of natural loves like family affection or friendship or romantic love, and says you need divine love to govern all of these, otherwise they go badly. And I just extended and applied that principle and said, well, is compassion, which is love for the hurting, the broken, and the weak, is that susceptible to the same kind of corruption? And my argument it is. And but it's hard for us to recognize, especially in a modern world which has elevated it so highly.
Yeah, absolutely. And you give several examples, which I'm glad you mentioned that. That's actually one of my favorite parts of the book, and it's at the very beginning. The several examples you give from The Great Divorce and from C.S. Lewis to this reality, right? Where you speak. I was trying to find it here in my highlights, but you talk about this example from The Great Divorce of, I believe her name is Pam. Yeah, I found it.
Mhm.
So Pam, who is one of these things that you just mentioned, one of these mothers who is just like obsessing over her
Devouring.
son, right? And one of the quotes that I wrote down here from your book is you mentioned a quote: "When natural affection becomes a god, it makes a total and ultimate claim to ownership." What's more, Pam's love. So for people, I guess for people at home, right? The issue here is that what Pam needs to let go is this obsession with her son that's keeping her from being able to move on to paradise, right? But she's not letting this thing go. And so you mentioned Pam's love for Michael, her son, has the appearance of sacrifice, but is in fact a complicated form of hatred. She protests that she gave up her whole life for Michael, that she sacrificed everything for his memory. But George MacDonald, Lewis's guide in The Great Divorce, points out that her love is not excessive but defective. She would rather have her son with her in hell than give up possession of him. And that's one of the examples that you provide of, well, there's this thing that all of us have experienced. It's positive, motherly love, but when it gets out of bounds, right, it's actually a complicated form of hatred, which I thought was a good way of putting it.
That's exactly right. And Lewis does that a number of places where he shows us the way in this context, right? If you move from mother love to empathy, the way that he calls it pity, that's his term for it, the passion of pity, becomes a tool of emotional blackmail. And anybody who's ever been on the receiving end of a pity party knows that experience. When someone puts you on a guilt trip, how does it actually work? Well, the idea is that you care for them, you love them, and if they seem to be sad, if they're hurt, then you're more likely to go along with whatever it is they want to do to make it better. And so people learn that and they take advantage of you. And so when you're in your family, somebody wants to do something and say it's destructive, harmful, sinful for them or for your family as a whole, and then they put on the long face, and then you go along with it. You go along with the thing you know is destructive, you know is harmful, but you do so out of this misguided compassion. What do we call that? And my answer is that's the sin of empathy.
Yeah. And so before we dive more deeply into this, uh, what are some of the positive or redeemable aspects of empathy? So when it's not untethered, when it hasn't gone too far, that we shouldn't throw out in toto, and then we'll move on from there to apathy.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So when you define it at that more basic level as just emotion sharing, it is a prerequisite for love. So being able to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, to see things from their perspective. Uh, Oftentimes when researchers get into this, they distinguish between typically what they call a kind of cognitive empathy and an affectional empathy. So cognitive empathy means I know where you're coming from. I rationally grasp how you got where you got, and I understand it. Whereas the affectional is I actually share the emotions that you have. And both of those, I think, in their place are good. I actually personally have a high level of cognitive empathy. I regularly, in debates and discussions, can kind of go, oh, I see how you got there. Like, okay, I don't agree with that, but like I see how you got there. I can put myself in your
Yeah.
position. And quite frankly, like my wife would tell you that I'm on a whole host of issues. I tend to be very generous to people and look for the best in them. Think, oh, they're probably just they misunderstand as opposed to malicious, sometimes to a fault. So both of those in principle are good, and I think commended in the Bible. I think of, for example, when Peter tells husbands, live with your wife in an understanding way. Okay. Live with your wife according to knowledge. There's a way in which a husband needs to see his wife and see what does the world look like from her vantage, and he needs to take that into account as he's seeking to live with her, as he's seeking to shepherd her as the head of his home. That's all to the good. I don't have any problem with that. But the point is, there's always limits. There's always boundaries. There's a point at which you say, I'm not going to join you in that great suffering or in the great uh, in the blasphemy that you're uttering against God, or the anger, or the whatever the emotions are that are threatening to sweep you off your feet. I can't go there because it would be false. It would be harmful and destructive.
Yeah. And so, how would you then, having defined empathy, defining some of the aspects of it that are negative and some of the ones that shouldn't be thrown out in toto, how would you define its twin error, apathy? And then, what are some of the different motivations behind apathy?
Yeah. So the way that one of the ways I put this in the book that can maybe help even clarify it is, if compassion or sympathy is the virtue, um, it's virtues go wrong in one of two ways. So take courage. Courage is a good thing. If you don't have enough of it, if you lack it, that's cowardice. If you have too much of it, that's recklessness. So in this context, sympathy normally is the word I use, or compassion is the word I use for the virtue. Um, and the excessive, untethered version goes under the name empathy, I think, in the modern world. Apathy would be the lack. And that's an indifference or a cruelty. Someone's drowning, someone's hurting, and you just turn your back and say, I don't care at all. Um, your suffering doesn't matter to me at all. I don't care. And in principle, I'm supposed to do something about this. So you think about the biblical examples would be when the guy, the Good Samaritan, when the fellows on the side of the road beat up, and the first two guys, the Levite and the priest, just walk by on the other side, like, oh, we're not messing with that. That would be a good example of apathy or indifference to his suffering, whereas the Good Samaritan would model biblical compassion.
Yeah. And so, by contrast, then, when it comes to that, again, the Good Samaritan there, how would you define sympathy, and then what really separates it? Like, how does it take the best that tethered empathy, I guess, has to offer? Or I guess in some degree, sympathy is kind of tethered empathy.
That's
Um,
right.
how does it take the best of what empathy has to offer while leaving the not so good stuff behind? And how does it also avoid the cold aloofness of apathy?
Yeah, I think that tethered empathy, sympathy, and tethered empathy would be the same thing as I would use it. So if someone wants to say, "Well, I like the word empathy and I want to keep using it," I'd say fine. I would recommend adding that adjective as a way of clarifying that you don't mean this tool of manipulation. But like Lewis, the word empathy doesn't show up in his writings because it didn't exist. He talks about pity, and the way that pity can be detached from justice and love and morality. And I think that's the fundamental difference. It's like at bottom line, are your feelings, even the feelings that you share from others, is it anchored to something? Is it anchored to Christ? Is he God, or are the feelings God? That's the fundamental kind of bottom line question. So an empathy becomes the sort of thing that abandons that in the name of compassion. Like I want to be so empathetic that I'm going to stay out of judgment and I'm not going to correct you.
Yeah.
I think when you look at there's different ways this has showed up. If someone comes and claim, when the Me Too movement was all the vogue and everybody was talking about this Me Too movement, was there real evil happening in the midst of that? Absolutely, there was horrific things that people who had been abused. But that good impulse to say, wow, this is a serious issue and we need to take accusations seriously was taken too far and corrupted when it became believe all women. Because the idea then was if you had questions, if you said, well, wow, this is really serious, we should go investigate. Well, we should call the police and have them look into it. Um, if you did that and you didn't simply say, I believe you wholesale, full stop, you were considered what? Callous, indifferent, apathetic, heartless, cruel. Those were the words that were used. And because, as I would say, Christian, the pastor, you didn't want to be labeled an abuser or an abuse enabler, you went along with a perversion of justice that said we're going to convict before we have trials. We're going to say someone's guilty before we've even looked. We're just going to accept at face value the first accusation that comes in the door. And while nobody says that's what we're going to do, that's the plan, effectively that's what happened, and it did so again under that banner of empathy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we'll get here in a couple of questions. Maybe we can run out the scope there on where untethered empathy has led us to ruin socially as a society, I guess, here in a minute. But before that, what are some ways that empathy, you would say, encourages epistemological vice?
Yeah, so I think one example that I think of when I hear that question is in all of our conversations about, say, race over the last decade, um, there was this phenomenon that came. It's called standpoint epistemology, which was the notion that, say, minority groups or oppressed groups had special insight into reality and had a kind of privileged vantage that the majority culture or the oppressor groups were blind to and therefore could not speak to. And that would be one way where, in the name of compassion, here's this we carve people up into oppressed classes and oppressor classes based on whatever criteria. So typically, straight white males are at the top of the oppressor hierarchy. And then racial minorities, women, quote unquote sexual minorities would have been at the bottom. And they're the ones with the privileged insight into what's really going on. And as a straight white guy, I'm unable to see it. That'd be a good way of a kind of epistemological vice that simply by
Yeah,
virtue of these characteristics, and it's a corruption of a true thing. Like sometimes people see things that other people don't see. And I'm fully willing to grant that that's a phenomenon, and that therefore there might be
yeah,
blind spots that people have in a majority culture. And I would say just as truthfully, though, it would work the other way, that there might be things that, say, a straight white guy sees that the black lesbian doesn't, and so it's not an absolute kind of we don't determine who's right simply by looking at what demographic boxes they check, but that was the sort of system that was erected during that kind of the height of the woke era was your demographic categories determined whether or not you had true insight into reality or not. And therefore, the people who
Yeah.
were on the wrong side of that hierarchy could be dismissed and needed to shut up.
Yeah, and I think this is where the tethered versus untethered, uh, uh, I guess, divide that you were discussing earlier really matters, right? Because to your point, there are times where we can say, and actually, I think it's a key part of proper and due prudence, right? To be able to understand that there are times where maybe there's someone else that's better positioned to see something that I'm not seeing, or maybe there's someone else that's involved in a given activity or whatever that I'm not as familiar with, and so I might trust their guidance a little bit. But it's again leaving, undoing the anchor and just going out and floating out, into the
Yeah.
open waters, and saying because where it gets like really ridiculous is I remember at the height of that, you had people, whether it's the race issue or whether it's the abortion issue or any of these other issues, it's almost like people wanted to excuse themselves, right? Where it was like almost like an epistemological black hole. It was like, oh, abortion, I literally cannot have an opinion about this because I'm not a woman, right? And so it was like that's it. There is no such thing as knowing anything about this topic, right? Because I'm not a
Right.
woman, or it was, well, there's no such thing as being able to comprehend at all what someone of a different ethnicity or whatever is going through. And so because of that, I just need to delegate out and outsource out my judgment and my responsibility on a lot of these issues to other people. And that it's like a complicated way of being, well, one, I would say a complicated way of being lazy, right? And
Mhm.
not wanting to actually research and look into things and build up the knowledge necessary, um, for how to handle these issues. And another thing, I also think it's cowardice as well, right? Because it's, if I can just pretend that there's no universe where I can know any of this, then I can avoid any hard conversations with anybody, or I can avoid any confrontations with anybody. I can avoid the unfortunate reality that there are times that people, when they're given free reign, sometimes just, especially on the internet, just as we'll talk about later, just come up with stuff, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I think a lot of it is, I guess, what would you say to that? In my mind, a lot of it, I feel like, is just laziness and cowardice, clothed by, oh, I can't possibly have an opinion on this issue.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the criticisms that's been leveled against the book is that the phenomenon I described, people would say, "Oh, you're talking about fear of man," and I'm going, "I am actually. That's in there. There's sections that are devoted to that." Um, but very few people just come right out and say, "I'm going to be a coward now."
Exactly.
Instead, what they say is, "I'm going to be compassionate now," and their compassion is a mask for the cowardice, and or their empathy is a mask for the cowardice. And so that's where some of the rhetorical force of what I've tried to do is say, "Look, people, this is what they're saying they're doing." And it would be fine to say, oh, they're not actually being empathetic, they're being enmeshed and codependent, they're not actually being compassionate, they're being a coward. And I'd say, great, let's get to that. But I'm also fine just saying, if that's if they say empathy means that, then I'll criticize
Exactly.
that. There's a great example of this recently. This is jumping ahead maybe to some of the cultural applications. I had a friend send me a picture the other day from the Mexico side of the United States border, and on the wall, the border wall, was written in big block graffiti letters the word empathy. And I just thought that's a perfect illustration, right? The idea there, right? The criticism leveled against the border wall is that it's unempathetic, right? You're not being empathetic because you have a border wall. And I thought that's the point. Empathy says no boundaries. Empathy says no walls, no borders, no
Yeah.
boundaries. And that's true of our interpersonal lives where we kind of fuse and mesh together and other people's emotions steer me. Or it's true at this kind of geopolitical level where we're not allowed to have borders for some reason in the
Yeah.
name of compassion. That's the sort of thing that I'm after.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, well, actually, then let me flip the order here, since you mentioned that, of the next two questions. What is a key issue in the culture that you would point to as a sort of case study of how untethered empathy has led to ruin?
Yeah, I'd give give two quick ones that I think most people, maybe most of your audience, would recognize. You mentioned the abortion issue, and I think that's a good place that emphasizes the way that empathy, when it becomes untethered, becomes myopic, and certain people, groups, classes become worthy objects of empathy, and therefore
Yeah.
we are indifferent or cruel to others. So in the case of abortion, the way that it's often justified is put forward a woman in distressed circumstances, hardship, single mom, pregnant, or maybe at the far ends, even the worst case scenarios are she's been raped. And she's presented to us as an object of compassion, and she is. Okay, so I want to say, yeah, we should absolutely feel compassion. But when untethered empathy gets going, it loses sight of what truth gets lost. And the answer is in that conversation, the humanity of her unborn child, who's totally lost in the shuffle and dispensed with using euphemisms like she needs to have choice or options. And that's a good example of like a way it's a manipulation. The humanity of the unborn is he's not an object of compassion. I shouldn't feel any compassion. I shouldn't even think about him. And how do I make sure that happens? Well, put all of your empathetic attention on this woman, this girl,
Yeah.
and that's a good example. Whereas I would want to say, what would tethered compassion? What would biblical compassion do? Well, it would execute the rapist. It would be moved with compassion to assist and help this young woman who's in distress. But what it wouldn't do is kill the baby. It would
Yeah.
regard both of them as objects of compassion. If it's that scenario. And I think that would be one example. The other one, which is a really kind of the apotheosis of this. I mentioned the immigration, but another would be the trans issue,
Yeah.
or even just the larger LGBTQ issues in general. This was the play that was run. It was gays and lesbians were presented as victims. They're in the closet. They're oppressed and persecuted by society. They can't be themselves. They can't be true to themselves. They're victims. Isn't this sad? And therefore, we're going to rearrange society in order to allow them to be themselves, in order that they can be who they really are, something like that. So they're presented as victims, objects of compassion, and now we're going to reorder society accordingly. And in the name of that compassion, we're going to pursue justice for them, which means they have the right to marry, quote unquote, marry each other. And then the trans movement picks the same idea up, and the T became the next frontier. And now mentally deranged men need to be accommodated. We'll rearrange society around their feelings, their desires, their persecution, their victimhood, and now they can compete against women in sports. They can be in the girls' locker room. They will use whatever pronouns they invent. All of that insanity, from sanctioning sodomy to letting girls compete or boys compete in girls' sports and into the girls' bathrooms and all of that was enabled by, covered by, and motivated by untethered empathy. That's what was doing it.
Yeah.
And so those are good examples where, and in all cases, you just lost touch with reality. Like there's no governor.
Well,
There's nothing
and
good
you
or
see that.
true.
Yeah, I was gonna say you see that even in the slogans that are used, right? You'll hear on the trans issue, would you rather have a gay son, or LGBT issue overall, right? Would you rather have a gay son, or no, I'm sorry, would you rather have a living trans son or a dead daughter, right? Like
Right.
this sort of thing that people will tell you, and so. And a lot of the same sort of stuff happens. The amount of times I've had conversations with people on the pro-life issue, where people will just be like, well, I can't imagine if that was my daughter, that something horrible had happened to her. Um, and it's like, again, people get played on this sort of like, well, what if this was you level? And what I find kind of interesting is that people should be asking that question and say, well, wait a second, if it was me, would I help my daughter in this situation and take care of the baby and honor God,
Right.
or would I advocate for murder? Right? Or,
Yeah.
well, if it was
Just
me, right, would I advocate for the mutilation of my son or daughter? And
right.
people don't seem to take that extra step because they're stuck in that preliminary sort of shock of, wow, you're a really unempathetic person right now,
Yeah,
right?
well, and that's one of the key, maybe one of the ways to get at the difference is untethered empathy is oriented primarily toward people's immediate feelings. Biblical compassion actually considers their long-term good. And so, what's all important, what dominates, and do the feelings matter? Yes, but are they the main thing that matters, the ultimate things? And it's like no. And there's ways in which we can often short circuit and seek a quick fix to the immediate feelings. Oh, they feel this way, so let's give them the hormone blockers. Let's castrate. Let's do the surgeries in order to relieve what we think will relieve the immediate distress. But in doing so, we're harming them deeply in the long run. And biblical compassion would say, okay, they feel that they're in the wrong body. let's do the hard work of trying to get their soul, their mind, which has been probably groomed and catechized into false ideologies. Let's try to bring that back to reality so that they conform to reality rather than trying to break reality in order to conform it to insane feelings. And so immediate feelings, long-term good, that's another way to get at what the difference is.
Hey everybody, I just want to take a second to say that if you're enjoying this video, I would highly encourage you to share it with your friends, hit that like button down below, and subscribe to my channel so that you can stay up to date with many more videos like this moving forward. And if you appreciate the content that I make on this channel and you would like to continue helping make it happen, I would encourage you to check out my locals community listed in the description down below and consider becoming one of my monthly supporters. With your help, I'm hoping to continue making in-depth, long-form videos exploring church history, theology, and apologetics from a reformational lens. I'll let you get back to the video. Thank you for your time. And this is why I actually think even saying something like the sin of empathy is a good thing, right? Because we want people to be asking this question of like, wait a second, if there is a way that I can sin by being empathetic, then what are the ways in which I can actually, again, not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but be tethered in my empathy, right? How can I actually, and it's funny because I mentioned earlier like the cowardice and the laziness, right? I feel like even, for example, for the abortion issue, for a lot of people, I think it's actually much easier to say, right, to hand wave like, oh, you know, if they need to get an abortion, safe, legal, and rare, I guess these days, right? Not even rare, right? Because that's been dropped. I think it's a lot easier to say, oh yeah, let them do that. It's even if oh, it's such a tragedy or whatever, than it is to say, hey, actually, can I adopt one of these children, or can I reach into my wallet and right and offer
Yeah.
help someone who maybe is considering this because she feels that she's alone and the guy didn't stick around and she has no resources, right? What are tangible ways that I can help? It's actually a lot easier to do the hand waving and to say, oh, I could. I'm so empathetic. I can't even imagine being in those shoes. I'm not even going to attempt to put myself there. Let her figure it out. It's a lot easier to do that, right, than to
Right.
do the hard work, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, what is a key biblical story that you would point to as a case study of how untethered empathy leads to ruin? And then on the flip side, what is a biblical story that you would point to as a case study of God honoring compassion and where that leads?
Yeah. So I often use Aaron as the golden calf for the first, which people kind of
Yeah.
get surprised by. So the most empathetic leader in the Bible is Aaron. And you say, what are you talking about? Well, here you have a distressed and traumatized people put through the ringer, slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. They've just watched a civilization commit suicide through, or be destroyed by plagues and fire from heaven and all. They had to put blood on the door to keep the baby, the kids alive, and all kind. They've been through it. They were at the Red Sea, watched Moses split it, and then watched the walls of water collapse on Pharaoh. So they've been through a thing or two. And now the man who has been sort of God's man among them, Moses, who's the prophet of God leading them, he's gone. He's up on the mountain. We don't know what happened to him. And they're distressed. They're fearful. They're anxious. And they know that their pagan neighbors back in Egypt had gods that comforted them and cared for them. They had idols. And so they come to Aaron and say, Aaron, we don't know what happened to Moses. We're afraid. We're scared. Make us gods who will go before us. And Aaron finds their distress and agitation unendurable and therefore goes with it, abdicates his authority as the priest, and instead he commits idolatry. And so that'd be a good example of someone who I think out of him, like, did Aaron forget what the law of God said? Probably not. It was 5 minutes ago that he got that word. Don't bow down to idols. But other people's emotions are powerful. And someone might say, oh, no, Aaron was just a coward. He feared man. I'm like, yeah, that's the point, right? Is that their emotions and that pressure was unendurable. He was not anchored to something, and therefore emotions swept him off his feet. So that'd be a good example of the kind of untethered. On the tethered side, long section in the book on Christ at the tomb of Lazarus, who, on the one hand, could have saved Lazarus all of that trouble, but waits. He doesn't go when they call for him whenever Lazarus is sick. He waits because he wants Lazarus to die and because he has a plan But Mary and Martha don't know that. Lazarus didn't know that. And when he comes, it's not that he goes, well, I have a plan, so I don't feel anything here. Instead, he weeps at the tomb of Lazarus. He feels with the women for the loss of their brother. He rages against death and the great evil that it is. So he joins them in that sorrow, but he doesn't lose himself in that sorrow because he has a plan to raise Lazarus from the dead and show his glory. So there would be an example of he does weep with them. He does join them in that sorrow, but he, and in the words of Hebrews, he was a sympathetic high priest who was tempted in every way as we are, but without sin. So he never sanctioned, endorsed, affirmed, celebrated sin in all of his compassionate moments. Right? He remained anchored to who God is and his mission.
It's interesting, right? Because you see, even in a lot of, for example, mainline churches and these sort of liberal church groups, so-called right church groups, um, a lot of them actually completely fundamentally misunderstand the incarnation and misunderstand the gospel because of untethered empathy, right? Where it becomes, you'll hear sometimes, you'll see these go viral on Twitter or other places where you'll hear of these a lot of the time pastrixes, not only pastrixes so called, but also sometimes even men who are in the role of pastor in some of these churches, where they'll say things like Jesus had to learn, right? He had to repent of his I don't know. They'll talk about when he's talking to Samaritans or other people, and they'll be like, he had to repent of his prejudices, or he had to learn, from these oppressed groups and this sort of thing.
Yeah,
Sometimes they'll, again, that's to the point where they never call people to repentance of anything except, I guess, white supremacy and or whatever, right? When it comes to things like any other kind of sin you can imagine, especially all kinds of sexual immorality, they never call anyone to repentance because for them, right, for them, what the truly empathetic Savior would do is just join them in their sin and just feel with them, and that's it, right? For them, that's like the sort of like pinnacle of what God could do. Whereas the real gospel message with actual compassion is Christ, yes, not being apathetic, right? But in fact, having compassion on us while we were yet his enemies, taking on flesh and joining us in this reality, and yet without sin, and yet without just leaving us there, but constantly proclaiming, right? Repent, for the kingdom is at hand.
that's right. Yeah, and frequently those kind of churches they want to be more compassionate than Christ. Like he's not compassionate enough. We actually see better, and he's caught up with us now. And that's why, yeah, even though the Bible condemns homosexuality or sexual immorality, we know better now because God learned that that wasn't truly compassionate. And I think that's actually there's an angle on this that's really interesting um, because progressives have sought to sort of own compassion and care and empathy as like this is our virtue, and conservatives, if you ask people on the street, random people, do you associate compassion and empathy with progressives or conservatives? Most of them are going to say progressives, and it's part of like effective propaganda. And it's a similar problem to what Christ faced in the first century, where if you asked a normal person in Israel, righteousness, who do you associate with righteousness? They would have said Pharisees. Pharisees, they're the righteous ones. And then Jesus said, well, unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you won't go to heaven. Right?
Yeah.
Their righteousness, right, is all a sham. It's virtue signaling, it's hypocrisy. They do the easy stuff and they don't actually do the hard stuff. They make sons of hell. Right? So Christ took this reputation for righteousness that the Pharisees had, and he just punctured it and tore it down. And there's a similar thing, I think, on this issue, which is I don't want Christians to celebrate callousness or indifference. I want them to be
Yeah.
actually compassionate, but I want them to get out from under the progressive definitions of those terms that abandon God's law, that become detached from justice. That's what I want. I want them out from under that, and to actually root their compassion in the scriptures and not in modern worldly progressivism.
And speaking of which, in your estimation, how does the sin of empathy run rampant in today's online discourse? I think that ties into this sort of progressive gaze idea, which you brought up and you discuss at length in the book.
Yeah, I think well you see because empathy has been an effective tool of emotional blackmail. Right now, um, when you watch the actions of, say, the Trump administration politically, we're going to deport people who are here illegally. The attack on that, or we're going to end DEI, or we're going to define man as this and woman as that. We don't flip anymore. The accusation being leveled all over the place then is you're heartless, you're uncaring, and that's an attempt to say, not just are you empathetic, but do you care about your reputation as a compassionate person? And I think that's something that conservatives and Christians have historically been very susceptible to. We want to think of ourselves. Nobody wants to be heartless. Nobody wants to be known as heartless, especially Christians who have a Bible that says be kind and tenderhearted. And so they found a very effective steering wheel to say, hey, if you don't go along with our agenda, we're going to call you names like heartless and cruel. And Christians have then sought to differentiate themselves from the heartless and cruel culture warrior type of Christians in order to win favor or accolades or be welcomed by the progressives who have sort of owned that definition. So I think that happens on online all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's and you really do see that playing out, I feel like, on almost every single controversy that happens, whether it's at a political level or whether it's at a sort of social level that the church is picking up on. Is So an interesting point that you make in the book, which I thought was actually pretty interesting, and it'll tie into the next question I have for you, is that it seems like a lot of people want to take into account, like, well, what about the, let's say, fiery leftist, right, who doesn't know Jesus, and we in fact want to love them, we want to be compassionate to them, and we want to be winsome to them in a real sense, but then that devolves into, so we should just give in to anything they want. Uh, but yet no one seems to ask the same question about, like, well, what about the far right person who is crazy? And it seems like no, it's an interesting double standard, right? Where it seems like on on one side you have the, well, we need to quote unquote love them so much that we just kind of like never call it out and we just fall into this ditch. Well, we're also going to completely avoid and condemn and get away from this completely other ditch. All right. And so it's like, well,
Correct.
you'd think that you would not want to fall into any ditches whatsoever, you know?
Yeah. There's a way in which that we basically said, in order to win the world, we define the world as progressive, secular, coastal elites, and then sought to play up those aspects of the Christian faith that would appeal to them and downplay those that wouldn't. So we're not going to talk about sexual ethics. We'll just mute ourselves. Maybe it's on our website somewhere, but you have to dig. And meanwhile, we're going to talk about climate change. We're going to talk about refugees, and we're going to talk about sexual minorities, and we're going to do all of the things to appeal to them. And we're going to attack enemies of the left. So we'll distance ourselves from other Christians who vote Republican or something. Um, and what rarely happened was, hey, you know what? We want to reach the world, so we need to figure out what issues really appeal to white working class folks in West Virginia, and let's figure out what political issues they care about, and let's show how the Bible fulfills it. So yeah, the Bible speaks of borders, and we need to have borders, and borders are important, and God wants our laws to reflect His law on borders, and nobody did that. That, like, the coal miner in the red hat was not an object of winsomeness. He was the punching bag
Mm.
for winsomeness. And I think that, like, that dynamic has been revealed. And I at one level, if it was an equal opportunity mechanism, right? Or even if a certain church felt called, like, hey, we're in a progressive city, and so we are going to try to show how the gospel, that would be one thing to say, like, hey, the gospel addresses issues you care about. But
Yeah.
one of the things the gospel is going to do to all of those things is it's going to cut against the grain of the sinful distortions of it. And so how do you ever get to that point? When is the moment when you have the actual, okay, yes, you share at some level a concern for the hurting, but Jesus said sodomy's wrong, right? The Bible teaches, like, when do you actually draw the line? And what
Yeah.
often happened is nobody wanted to draw any lines anywhere because it was an appeasement strategy, not an evangelism strategy.
Yeah, that's a really good way of saying it. It's an appeasement strategy, and again, you see that play out, in my opinion, in the sort of like everyday level, right? In your average person on the street, the appeasement strategy comes out anytime there's a hard conversation at hand, right? Every time that maybe a gay coworker asks, they mention, I don't know, their partner that they're living with or whatever, and immediately it's like that flip switches on, which I actually think is a sort of like ad hoc move, right? Where maybe, and I'm sure this has happened to
Right.
all of us at some point in time, right? Where you weren't prepared for that conversation, or you didn't want to have that conversation with that person in that moment, and so it's like you just kind of appeased and let it go. And then later there's the ad hoc rationalization, right? Where it's like, well, actually, I'm trying to be winsome and I'm trying to not scare them away. It's like, no, we need to be honest and be like, well, maybe in that moment, maybe I was being a coward, right?
Yeah. And
The
I
interesting thing
and
that
I've
I've
got a
seen, yeah,
category.
go on.
Yeah, no, and I've got a category for that kind of, for it actually being a wisdom call. Like this isn't the place to a time to have that conversation, but it's one thing to say I'm going to have it in a different way, or I'm going to take my shot. It's another thing never to take the shot, and actually to go the other direction, right?
Yeah,
Which is actually what ended up happening, where the church began to say, well, maybe those things aren't as bad as we thought. Maybe they aren't bad at all, and instead simply adopted that worldly agenda wholesale.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and trying to avoid again, untethered empathy, and also the other pitfall that is apathy. What would you say to the, because there's an interesting thing going on right now, is there seems to be a cultural shift to the right, where you're now seeing a lot more people, especially on social media, trying to be, loud and proud, and yeah, like Christ is Lord, epic, right? That's awesome. But you also have a lot of people who are now, it seems like, trying to go in the opposite direction, where it's like, yeah, now we're just engaging in endless mockery, and just going viciously going after people, and even if that means gossiping and spreading rumors or whatever else it may be, the mentality seems to be, one, well, they've been doing this the opposite charade to us for way too long, and two, there's something about being on the internet where it's almost like we think that internet sins we're not going to have to give an account for them on judgment day, right? And so
That's
what
right.
would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that there. Yeah, I think because of the widespread um, ways that some of these things were used as tools of manipulation, part of the backlash is to go to another extreme. I don't think that the other extreme, it's not an equal and opposite danger.
Yeah.
It might be at an individual level, and it might be as a pastor of an individual church that you see it in your congregation. But societally, it just can't be, because the major institutions of society are still, even now, largely progressive. They may be muted progressives in the face of the Trump's election and this kind of vibe shift, but formally they're committed still to progressivism. And so that's always going to you're always going to be swimming against that grain. And so, as a pastor, I want to be alert to whatever the dangers in my congregation or my community are. So I'm alert to that and want to address them wisely there. But I don't simply want to socially. I don't want to jump because progressives say jump, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a habit that Christians got into.
I think it's a really important and good distinction, right? Which is knowing, knowing exactly where we're standing at a given moment, right? If I'm talking to somebody where it's like, okay, this person is just lost in the sauce and they're, being a complete and total like jerk, and engaging in sinful behavior online, maybe I address that with that person. But we want to avoid the false equivalencies, which leads me to my next question, which is, how should we balance both avoiding falling prey to the progressive gaze on one end, and also avoiding falling prey to the sort of tribalistic, no enemies to the right mentality on the other end, without then giving the appearance of like, well, socially these are both, at this very moment, uh, I guess at equal levels on the danger scale, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, it does. I mean, my way of dealing with it is recognizing what I'm responsible for and what I think the biggest dangers are, and keeping my eye on the ball. So I think the biggest dangers are still progressive dangers, even with the potential rise of, people are concerned about the rise of a kind of, in reaction to wokeness, a kind of white identitarianism, or kinism or something like that, or the anti-Semitism that can kind of sometimes crop up. And it's like, I'm aware of that. I see it. And I'm alert to it in my community. Should I see it there? And have, our pastors have done various things to try to make it inhospitable. Like there's a kind of climate control that you can do, which doesn't require you to denounce every time somebody says something stupid on the internet. I just refuse to play that game. There's lots of things that I think are dumb that I just ignore. And then there's lots of things that are dumb and evil. There's things that are dumb and evil that I ignore. And there's things that are dumb and evil that I will address regularly. And there's reasons for it. It's not simply because some evil's okay. It's that I don't think that evil has the same cultural purchase. I don't think it's as dangerous. I think there are better ways to deal with it given where it's coming from and how it operates. Like ignoring it will actually be a better strategy than getting into a fight with an anonymous Twitter account over something. Whereas when it comes to big, out in the open, high-handed rebellion, right, done in public with names attached, that's the sort of thing that's the big idols of the day. And so there'll be more public speech there, addressing it there. So I've had people who've sort of on this topic even who've said to me, Joe, you may be really careful making these distinctions and so forth, but not everybody who reads your book is going to be, and they're going to use sin of empathy to justify cruelty and callousness. What do you think about that? And I said, well, I just think that's possible, right? Maybe even likely. And if anybody ever figures out how to write something that is incapable of being twisted or corrupted, they're more than welcome to teach me. I would be happy to learn. But if the scriptures can be twisted, so can the words of Joe Rigney. My job was to make that difficult. That in order to use my work that way, they would have to be ignoring part of my work. So in my book, there's sections on the sin of empathy and in praise of compassion. Both of those are in there. Yeah. And so I've said what I need to say, and then I don't feel the need to go be the internet police.
Yeah. Well, it's something else that I think it's helpful, and I'm curious for your perspective on this, and I've seen this in all sorts of like different movements, whether political or whether we're talking within the church. So for example, it's like right now, right, the biggest threat to society really is, right, secularization. We have in certain parts of society, not in America, but in Europe especially, rising numbers of Islam when it comes to Islam and this sort of thing. And so I feel like sometimes you'll end up with people saying, like, whether it's to me in my channel or whether it's to other individuals, where it's like, for example, in the realm of apologetics, where it's like, really, you're doing Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox apologetics? Hello, are you not looking around? Christendom is in crisis, right? Or we'll have people, I don't know, who someone's doing like Mormon apologetics, and someone will be like, why aren't you doing apologetics against atheism? And it almost becomes like a bit of a I don't know, you're like raising money to help starving puppies, and someone's like, but what about all the starving kittens
Yes.
out on the street? And so one of the things for me is, I think, I don't know, and I know it's kind of hard to gauge and to move things in the right direction, but for me it's like, I feel like if 90% of our apologists are dealing with atheism, Islam, and then the remaining 10% are dealing with whatever, Mormon, whether it's Mormonism or Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, or whether it's Talmudic Judaism that the
Yeah.
Netter guys love so much, whatever it may be, that's awesome, right? Like, like, I don't know. In my mind, it's like, if we have the minority of people calling this stuff out and going against this stuff, as long as the majority understands what the big threat is at the moment, I actually don't think that's a problem. But I see like people online where it's like, if someone does content, let's say, against kinism, or someone points out like, hey, actually a lot of this anti-Semitic stuff is getting kind of weird, let's look at some arguments in relation to this. It's like everyone loses their mind and they're like, are you serious? Right? We right now we're dealing with the left, and it's like, well, I think a lot of our guys are are doing a good job with this at the moment,
Yeah.
But if a
Yeah.
lot of people are not dealing with some of this other stuff, I don't see the issue with a minority of our people dealing with that. But it seems like people are not able to understand that you can have different, I guess, areas of focus while altogether moving in the right direction. If that makes any sense.
No, that's right. I think that's exactly right. I think it's totally legitimate for people to have particular callings and to do those to the best of their ability. And hands shouldn't be looking at feet going, why aren't you more hand-like? Why don't you do what hands do?
Yeah.
I think it would be in that kind of bucket. And if you say, well, we need more feet because the foot problems are the big problems, and I would say, well, that would be a question of proportion. Are we overemphasizing? That would be a corporate church problem, but not one of an individual. So I think it's totally legitimate for people to have different ministries that they're trying to do, all pulling in the same basic direction.
Yeah. So, well, as we reach here, our last two questions, my second to last question for you is the following. So, in his epistles, the Apostle Paul speaks several times of the reality of the weaker brethren, those who possess a weaker conscience, and the stronger brethren who possess a stronger conscience, having to live together and to bear with one another as part of the same church in love, right? So, not even just barely tolerating one another, but having to love one another. So, how would you summarize the Apostle Paul's teaching on this issue? And what are some of the common misapplications of this teaching, which fall into the sort of untethered empathy or the passion of pity problem, as you describe it in your book?
Yeah, I think this is one of the places that I think this is a really great question that people have used, and I've used sort of the work of Edwin Friedman, who says basically institutions get hijacked when they cater to the weakest and most immature members. Um, and the pushback biblically would be, well, doesn't Paul do that when he says we should accommodate the weaker brother? And I think it's a really good point, provided a couple of things. The first is, do we know who's who? Because if you think about it,
That's a good point.
in when Paul's doing that in First Corinthians and in Romans, it's very clear which positions he regards as the stronger, more faithful, biblical, true position, and which one he's accommodating as I don't want to crush the weaker brother. And oftentimes there's actually confusion precisely on that point in these debates. So sometimes the issue of alcohol gets used as a good example of accommodating weaker brethren. Um, and insofar as you're talking about, hey, here's someone whose families had drunkards, alcoholism, and so they don't drink, and so you decide in order to I'm not going to serve wine at dinner when I have them over because I don't want to cause them to stumble. They were drunkard for a while. I don't want to do that. I think that's a great application of what Paul says. But everybody in that situation knows who's accommodating whom and why, right? They're the weaker brother. I'm the stronger brother. I drink alcohol. It's fine, but I'm going to not put wrong pressure on their conscience. That's different than if there's a faction in my church that demands that everybody stop drinking alcohol, become a teetotaler, because they're actually presenting themselves as, we have the right answer. We're the biblical ones, and you guys are compromisers and worldly. And at that point, it's not applying First Corinthians to accommodate them. The text you need to apply is one of the Gospels where Jesus resists Pharisees. And I think there's a similar thing that can happen in some of these other issues where I have a category as a pastor for say a racial minority who's had a lot of real hard things happen to them in their life that they attribute to racial prejudice and partiality. And I've got a category for like listening to them, um, hearing their story, trying to understand where they're coming from, and all of that. And if that's all we're doing, that's great. I think that would be potentially a bearing with the weak. They're a victim, they're hurting, and I'm bearing with them. But if we pivot, then all of a sudden, and now it's like, what are we going to do about this? What are the solutions? If I'm not allowed to ask questions, propose solutions, contribute to the discussion because I have the wrong skin color, now we're in the realm of manipulation.
Yeah.
Right now it's not about getting to the best biblical decision. I'm being sidelined and steered and need to resist it. And so that's one of the ways that the good impulse to accommodate weaker brethren on whatever issues could be hijacked, and we should resist it.
And how would someone, whether it's in that situation that you just brought up or just in general, how would someone properly embody what you call the action of pity toward other people in your book?
Yeah. So the action of pity. It's a phrase from Lewis where he says, it leaps from the heights of joy to the depths in order to rescue the suffering and those who are going to perdition. So it's Christ-like love that goes to the dark places. But when it goes there, it refuses to lie. Like that's like the fundamental thing is the action of pity will not flatter. It will not lie. It will not embrace falsehoods. It will not blaspheme. That's what the action of pity. And so there's a way in which, like, if you think about the story of Job, when his wife, whose 10 children just died, when she comes to him in her grief and despair and says, "Curse God and die," a lot of us would look at that situation and say he should just agree with her, right? Join her in that pain. And instead, he says, "You speak foolishly. You speak like one of the foolish women," right? And in doing so, he's actually being compassionate to her. He's not being cruel, even though the world would say he's being cruel because she's hurting and he's rebuking her. Um, but it would be cruel to endorse her blasphemy, to affirm the blasphemy, to join her in the blasphemy would be far more harmful and destructive for her in the long term than to say, I can't go there with you, honey. I can't. God gives us good. God brings evil. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I'm clinging to him. I don't understand. I don't get it. This doesn't make sense. I have questions, but I'm clinging to God for dear life. I'm not going to curse him. That's actually compassion to her, right? He's loving her in that way. That's what the action of pity would do.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, and for the to avoid the sort of opposite mistake of apathy that people fall into, it wouldn't be in this situation. I don't know, Job rebuking her, and then being like, whatever, go grieve on your own. We're completely done here. Like, you know what I mean? It would be, yeah.
Right.
There's a time to rebuke people, and then also once they've repented, to sweetly, as the gospel
Yeah.
does, right, speak words of God's promise to them, right, and to help them, and to be like, what are actionable steps I can take to help get this person out of this hole that they're currently in. So my final question for you, brother, before we close out here is, so one of the key areas that I seek to address on this channel, which I kind of mentioned a little bit ago, is what some of us on the Reformation Apologetics corner of YouTube have termed ecclesial anxiety. So a significant portion of my viewership either struggles with intense fear and anxiety regarding the exclusivity claims of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, or they at least know someone or have a loved one who does. How can someone who is struggling with this anxiety firsthand avoid the passion of pity, avoid untethered empathy, whether for themselves or for somebody else, as you define it in your book?
Yeah. Well, so let's say if it's somebody let's start there. That would be where the empathy can come into play. It would be so say you have a loved one who's really, really wrecked by the possibility that the Roman Catholic Church is the true church, and they don't know, and there's uncertainty and that anxiety. I've seen it, I know what you're talking about. One thing you could do is you would follow. In the book, I lay out kind of a four statements that kind of summarize what true compassion would say to anybody who's hurting. First one is, this is really hard. So these questions are hard. I know, I just want you to know this is really hard. And the second is, I know you feel that way. Like, I see your pain. I see the distress. I know it's there. I see it. The third would be, I'm with you in it. Like, I'm here. I'm here for you. I'm for you. I'm not against you. And then the fourth is, I have hope. And that's the one that's really important in this scenario. Oftentimes in the grip of that kind of despair and anxiety, people can lose sight of the sun. They're in the darkness. And it's important for you to bring the sun with you when you're with them. So they can't see it, but you see it. And there's a way in which what you're offering to them is like, I know you can't see the Lord. He seems really dark, and you feel like you've been forsaken, and you don't know what's up and what's down. But you know me, and I'm here, and I love you, and I care for you, and so I'm with you in this. And I can see Him, right? I have so much faith right now. God has good for you. Let's just keep doing what God tells us to do. What are the things we know that He wants us to do? Well, He wants us to read the Bible. He wants us to gather with His people. He wants us to cry out to Him in prayer. So let's just keep doing those, and we'll trust Him to give the light. So that would be what I would say to the person who's helping. The person who's in it, I think one of the, I don't know how you typically do the apologetics, but the exclusivity claims of when you, just the very fact you have to frame it that way, the Roman Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
so no matter what, I have to pick. So at the end of the day, I have to decide for myself. Like, I can't outsource that decision. And that's often where the anxiety comes from, is it's such a weighty decision. And people go, so I've got to pick the right church. One of the advantages in my mind of Protestantism is precisely at this point. One of the reasons I can't be a Roman Catholic is that I'm too Catholic. Like, I'm too Catholic to be Catholic. I think wherever the word is preached, I think wherever the gospel runs, I think wherever Christ is, I think wherever the word is preached, Christ's there. And so that means I can look at a Roman Catholic church, which I think is in serious error, and I can say, but if the Bible's preached and Christ is set forward, despite their, what I regard as wrongful fascination with Mary and their nonsense thinking about the Lord's Supper and their elevation of the papacy, all of those things, despite all those errors, could Christ save somebody there? Could He cause the new birth, draw them to Himself, and save them from their sins? I think absolutely. There's Roman Catholics who are Christians. Same thing with Eastern Orthodox. Same thing can happen there. So wherever Christ is, so I'm so Catholic that Wherever God's people are, those are my people. Whereas it's the other groups, it's the other two that I think are sectarian, because they say in order to be in, it's not enough to trust in Christ. You have to be
Yeah.
a part of the right institutional communion with the right head, submitted to him and we can't even tell you in all the ways, like which councils are authoritative and which ones aren't, and those have to be interpreted too. You solve, basically, for people who are dealing with the ecclesial anxiety, none of your problems will be solved by outsourcing, so to speak, outsourcing your decision making to Rome or to the East. You still have to, you can't, you're a human. Welcome to the world. It's on your shoulders. It's a weighty responsibility. And know that God is merciful and gracious, abounding in steadfast love. That's the kind of God he is. He reveals himself in Christ. So go there, go to him, and then find his people.
Yeah, and that ties back into what we were talking about, trying to avoid epistemological vice when it comes to untethered empathy. Because if I'm sitting there having all this untethered empathy, I guess, for myself in this instance, and I know normally it's for somebody else, but in this instance, I'm just feeling bad for myself throwing a pity party. Um, when you're in that mindset, and like you said, you can't see the sun, you can't see anything, you're just anxious all the time. Just like we said before, when you're dealing with a hard situation with somebody else, it becomes really easy to want to shirk that responsibility. Oh, this is an epistemological black hole. I can't access truth because I'm not the right race, or I can't access truth. I'm not the right gender. I can't access truth. And in this instance, I think like a lot of the time that tends to happen as well, where it's, well, I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do. It might just be that I can't access truth. I can't read scripture because it's an interpretation of an interpretation or whatever silly narrative I've been sold on. I can't interpret anything. I can't. In fact, I'm fallible. I can't make any decisions. Let me outsource this out of this epistemological black hole to the papacy, and let me not ask too many questions there, as though right, as though they don't need to make decisions about what the Pope means by things. They don't need to make decisions. And I think when we're in that dark place and we don't slow down, like you're saying, we don't have friends that are actually being compassionate toward us and getting us out of our head, getting us to stop the navel gazing. If we take no effort to research and do the hard work, if we just give into the epistemological black hole here, because I feel so bad for myself or I feel so bad for my friend, I'm just going to tell him to jump ship and go to Rome. Then really we are just deferring our responsibility to somebody else, whether it's the Pope or whether it's the council, whatever it may be. And we will one day be held accountable for that. Right? It's like people forget that there's a decision still being made here. The same decision that the person who's not wanting to deal with the abortion issue, the same as the person who doesn't want to deal with the race issue or whatever else it may be, the gender issue, they're going to be held accountable one day, and we will as well for what we chose to do with that decision. Does that make sense?
Amen. Amen. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you so much, brother. Once again, for people at home, the book is The Sin of Empathy by Dr. Joe Rigney, Compassion and Its Counterfeits. If you guys want to check it out, Dr. Rigney, I'd love to have you back on at some point if we could get our schedules to line up again, maybe to talk a little bit about, because we didn't really get to talk about the feminism part of the book and the sort of, gender issues at play here when it comes to empathy. I'd love to be able to unpack that at a different time. I'd love to also be able to run a few questions by you, because I find myself mostly in agreement with the things you're saying. I just have a few areas where I'd love to ask you a few more questions there.
Great.
Where I'm not so sure if we completely line up, but again, great book. People should go check it out. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we head out?
No, that's great. Thanks for having me on.